Okay, then I think we're ready to get started. Welcome to you all, and thank you for staying for this very last part of the ISBNPA Conference 2019. So we're having a public panel discussion on sustainable health. My name is Knut-Inge Klepp, and I'm with the Norwegian National Institute of Public Health, and I'm also a fellow of the society, and I'm very honored to be called to moderate this debate that we're having. The overriding theme of the ISBNPA conference this year has been Healthy People, Healthy Planet. And the aim of this panel discussion is to consider what can we do from a behavioral nutrition and physical activity perspective in order to achieve both healthy people and a healthy planet. So we have three excellent speakers, panel participants this afternoon. They are Professor Elling Bere, Dr. Wilma Waterland, and Professor Stephen Allender. So please welcome them. I'll briefly introduce them before they have a chance to give their brief introductions to the discussion. First, Professor Elling Bere. He is a senior researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health and also a professor in public health at University of Agder, Norway. Elling is particularly interested in intervention research and determinants of eating behaviors and physical activity, and also particularly interested in the issue concerning social inequalities. His main current research topics includes active transportation, and he will be presenting on sustainable physical activity. Dr. Wilma Waterlander is a scientific researcher at the Amsterdam UMC, University of Amsterdam, Department of Public Health. Wilma was a fellow for the Lancet Commission on Obesity that recently published its report on the global syndemic of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. She is also a fellow of the International Council for Science, Food Futures Early Career Network. And in her current research, she combines methods from system dynamic and participatory action research to develop innovative, accessible, and sustainable approaches to promote healthy eating habits in young adolescents from multi-ethnic lower socioeconomic groups. And she will be presenting on sustainable diets. Stephen Allender is a professor of public health and the founding director of the Global Obesity Center, GLOBE, at Deakin University. And that's also a World Health Organization collaborating center for obesity prevention. Steve has an ongoing program of research on solving complex problems with a focus on the burden of chronic disease and obesity prevention. But he also has particular interest in malnutrition and climate change in developed and developing countries and the possibilities for using complex system approaches for community-based intervention. And he will be presenting on sustainable health and obesity. So each of the panel members will be given a short presentation on sustainable physical activity and nutrition, and also what they see people can do from a behavioral perspective. Following their presentation, we will have a panel discussion, and we also very much welcome questions and comments from the audience. So with that, I invite Elling Bere to come and give his presentation.
Thank you, Knut-Inge. And thanks for being invited. It's a great pleasure to be here. The topic of sustainability is huge, and I want to focus on a small part of it. So I want to talk about physical activity, transportation, CO2 emissions, and energy expenditures. And this is how it all were before. We were physically active, we were burning energy, we were emitting CO2 through our breathing. And the energy we obtained from food, and food was produced by plants, by sunlight and CO2 from the atmosphere. So this is the carbon cycle. We were part of a natural carbon cycle. Now it's different because now we produce the food ourselves. We do not hunt and gather wild food anymore, and the food production is related to carbon emissions, great carbon emissions, maybe as much as 30% of the man-made carbon emissions. So the more physical active we are, the more food we need, and the more carbon emissions there will be. Also, we need equipment for doing physical activity. I myself is really fond of skiing, and I think I have too many pairs of skis. You need bikes, and you need facilities to do activities such as gyms, fitness centers, ski areas, and so on. And you also need transportation to get there. It's now popular to go skiing in Japan, living in Norway. And a few factors that are important in this respect is the industrialization, because we have been, like Barry Popkin was talking about too, we have earlier on, we used our own energy to do things, but now we use machines. Machines use fossil fuels, and therefore the emission of carbon dioxides. And also land use. We need a lot of land to produce the food for the soon 8 billion people. And industrialization also has made it so easy for us. Before we hunted and gathered, and we had to use energy in order to obtain energy. Now we drive to work, we earn money, we drive to the store, and then we change the money to food, and then we drive back home. Or we can sit home and ordering food on internet. And this compensation is energy that we don't really have to energy that we don't really has to spend. It's added energy. So and we are not. So even if it's so simple for us today, we are not we are not physical active enough, and we need recommendations that says how physical active we should be. And for me, being a biologist and also being into public health nutrition, it was a surprise to learn how intense you have to be in order to reach the physical recommendations. And I myself learned that 6 METs, that is the limit for vigorous activity, is not like hard training. This is just an example. I'm really into baking, and I have a colleague at the University of Agder that is really into measuring things. So he measured the intensity while me kneading a bread dough. And as you can see here, I was laying almost on 6 METs, that is vigorous physical activity by bread baking. And when I tried as hard as I could, at the end, I was far above 6 METs. And even before I started to knead this dough, the intensity by just mixing the ingredients, I was already on moderate intensity. And then, so this is how little is needed in order to reach the intensity for the recommendations. And we also did a study on this on students. It's not yet published, but they had a whole bread baking process where they started to mix the ingredients, and then they kneaded the dough, and then they did the dishes. And of this 30 minutes time, 15 of those minutes were in above moderate intensity activity. So if you bake bread for 5 days a week, and there's lots of good reasons for baking bread, then you get half the recommended amounts of physical activity. But that is bread baking, but the great potential, I think, lays in active commuting, because most of us are working, and we have to go to work, and we have to go back home 5 days a week, and that is 10 trips a week, and I don't know how far you think people should walk or cycle, but I think we could expect people to walk or cycle 30 minutes maybe each way, but even half of that, 15 minutes each way will give you the 150 minutes of physical activity. And then a few years ago, we got a few e-bikes at the university, and when I started, or when I tested the e-bike, I felt it was so easy. I don't know, have all of you tried e-bikes? Could those raise your hand that have tried e-bikes? Okay, yeah, so it's less than half of you. And there is a known thing that everybody that tries an e-bike the first time gets a smile on his or her face. So I recommend those of you who have not tried an e-bike to try an e-bike. But we tested it because I felt it was so easy, and if people were stop cycling and starting to e-cycle instead, that would be bad for the physical activity. But when we measured the intensity of physical activity, it was measured to 6.8 METs, and then that is above vigorous activity. And we compared this to normal cycling, and normal cycling was more intensive, of course, but this is much more than what I expected. And also, several other studies have done the same thing, and a recent review study looked at 9 studies that measured intensity of e-biking with MET values from 4.9 to 8.3. So even if e-biking seems so easy, is physical activity above moderate activity. But what about the link to sustainability and carbon emissions? And this is a report from the European Cycling Federation, and they are estimated carbon emissions per passenger kilometers. And as you see, as you can see, that the e-bike and the bike has the same carbon emission, and the carbon emission of biking is about 10 times or more lower than the emissions of a car. So that is a very good thing, of course. But look, it's another interesting thing, and they looked at the difference in diets. So if your diet if you have a beef diet, a strict beef diet, this is extreme examples, but I really like those extreme examples. But if you have a beef diet, the carbon emission will be 163 grams per kilometers, and then you're getting closer to the emissions of a car. But if you go on a strict extreme diet the other way, they measure it from soybeans. There's only 6 grams emitted per kilometer. So food really matters. And also, one thing with that report was that they used lower intensity values for cycling and e-cycling. They said that e-cycling was 2.5 METs, but as I showed you, e-biking is much more. So I tried to recalculate the same calculations using other MET values from one of the studies that was included in the review, where biking had a MET value of 5.8, e-bike 5.1, and walking 4.5, because I also included walking in these calculations. And as you can see, the carbon emitted is higher, but it's still similar for bike and e-bike. And you can see the blue part is the production of the bike, and the e-bike has somewhat more emission related to production, and then it's the production of the electricity used, and then the great part is the food. And also interesting here is to see how walking compares to biking, because walking is less intensive, but it's much, much slower, so you spend longer time for the same distance. So in this example, walking is emitting more carbon than biking. And this is all according to the food that they ate. And I think these figures might be overestimated, because it's not certain that all the calories extra that you get when you bike or walk will come from food. Some of you might also lose weight. But then I compare that part just for fun with data from the European Environmental Agency. And on the left, you see a petrol car and a diesel car with high emissions of carbon. And then on the far right, you see an electric car using electricity from produced by burning coal, which is even above petrol and diesel. But look at the smallest column. That is electric car powered by clean energy, water, wind, or solar energy, which is much, much, much less. And then I use the same scale, and you can see that walking, it's not that much difference between walking and an electric car running on clean energy. And I don't really know if these are totally comparable, so probably not, but my main point here is that as cars are getting more and more efficient and cleaner, our fuel is going the other way. We eat more meat. In Norway we eat more meat, and globally we eat more meat. And if we eat more meat, the emissions of our physical activity will go up. So I was asked what people can do from a behavioral perspective, and I think there are especially two important things. And the first thing is that you should incorporate the physical activity into daily life rather than compensating, because compensating will be an addition. And then active transportation is really important, of course, and also that the activities you do should be locally based, because then you have less transportation, and then also use of less specialist equipments. For instance, you need several bikes. And the second thing that I think might be equally important is that you have to consider your fuel, and that is the topic of the next talk. So a sustainable diet and a lower animal diet is really important also for a sustainable physical activity. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that. So I'll move on to the next topic and talking about this sustainable fuel or sustainable diets. And a lot of what I will talk about today, I've actually stolen from the two major reports recently published by The Lancet, so from the Lancet Eat Commission and the Lancet Global Syndemic Obesity Report, where Steve Allender will also talk about a little bit. So just to start, what is a sustainable diet? So if we look at the definition by the Lancet Eat Commission, they stated that this is a diet that meets nutritional requirements within planetary boundaries. And you might wonder, what are these planetary boundaries that they are talking about? I think the first one is greenhouse gas emissions or climate change, and I think this is the one that most people are most familiar with. So really looking at these high greenhouse gas emissions, for example, from red meat production. But there's also lots of other important indicators to look at when we talk about a sustainable diet. So one of them is land system change. And I've looked about this a little bit in my research in New Zealand, and it's funny when you think about New Zealand and the beautiful landscapes that we've just seen in the closing ceremony. But if you look in detail, you see that actually 52% of that beautiful landscape is for agricultural use. So it's either for animals or to grow crops. So, and that's what we mean by this landscape change. So a lot of the land we see is used for agricultural purposes. The other factors are freshwater use, nitrogen cycling, phosphorus cycling, and also finally the biodiversity loss, which is also related again to this land system change, where you see this monocultures of lots of the same kind of foods being grown instead of having a large biodiversity of all kinds of different crops. So within these planetary boundaries, they came up with a healthy diet, and they did this also looking into the future. So this is a diet for the estimated 10 billion people who live on our planet by 2050 within a safe operating space. And this diet looks as follows. So we should have an optimal caloric intake, so don't eat more than we need, consisting of a diversity of plant-based foods, low amounts of animal-sourced foods. And this also depended a little bit across the globe. So if you live in countries where that it's really difficult to grow plants, maybe in dry areas in Africa, then these populations rely a little bit more on animal-sourced foods. But that's all incorporated. But these are the global results I'm talking about here. So this should contain unsaturated rather than saturated fats and limited amounts of refined grains, ultra-processed foods, and added sugars. So now I was wondering, from the people who are still here, who thinks that they consume this kind of diet? So just to check how far are we? Well, half, maybe? Yes, so over there, not so about maybe 50%. So that's hopeful, but also shows that even within our society, we have a long way to go. And that's what we see here. So are we nearly there? Well, no, we're not even close there. So here you see the bars for the different countries or different regions in the world, and where they are currently at for the different food groups, and then where they should be at the white dotted bar. And as you can see, the global adoption by 2050 will require a 50% reduction in sugar and red meat consumption across the globe, and a 100% increase in fruits, vegetables, and nuts and legumes. But not only that, to really be within safe boundaries, we also need to reduce food loss and food waste, and major improvements in practices of food production. So this also considers that maybe we can optimize the way we grow food or agricultural practices, so that's incorporated. So we need to do improved agriculture and change our diet. So not or. So how do we get there? So I think Steve will talk about this in a little bit more detail, but I'll just quickly note that we know how to get there. We don't know how to get there, sorry, we know what to do. So that's what this slide shows. As part of my role in the Lancet Commission, together with Boyd Swinburne, we went through this pile of reports from the United Nations bodies, such as WHO, FAO, showing what policy recommendations for governments of what they could do. And all these reports were just full of evidence-based recommendations, and it's very clear that, as it says on the top, we should make healthy foods and sustainable foods more available, accessible, and affordable instead of unhealthy alternatives. And then also some of the other things below that are a little bit less drastic, but that's the things we have to do. But are we doing it? Well, we all know that's not the case. There's the two most obvious things we can do, things like food labels. So everyone always, also outside our field, they say, can we maybe just have a label that shows that food is sustainable and it's healthy? Well, I think we all now know, and also after Barry Popkins' talk, that food labels, they don't work. So maybe they give to some consumers a little bit extra insight, but they really won't change behaviors at large scale. And also already we can't agree on one simple logo that food industry is willing to implement, or that's mandatory across countries and across the globe. So the other one is dietary guidelines. And even here the message is, yeah, we can't even do that. So we've looked at the Americans, the dietary guidelines for Americans, and here they've tried to incorporate sustainability into the guidelines. And it was unsuccessful due to pressures and lobby from the meat industry and also from the sugar and sugar-sweetened beverage industries. So far there's only a few countries like Sweden and Brazil who've actually been able to come up with good dietary guidelines. So the conclusion of that Lancet report was really that we should not think more about what we should do, but how do we get there, and how can we address these vested interests and from both political and commercially parties. So the actions, and there's more, but I'll just list a few of them here. So what can we do? So a very obvious one is the fourth one, for example, redirect the $5 trillion of subsidies that are currently going to fossil fuels and the unhealthy food industries. We could easily redirect them into more sustainable business models. But there's other things what we can do, and we can debate that later. So I thought I could end my talk with some discussion points. I think us on the panel kind of agree, so maybe I thought I'd put some provocative points out there that maybe the audience doesn't agree on. So I think what we as researchers can do, I think we can first of all walk the talk. So I came here by train, and I was stunned how many of my European colleagues flew up here, came by plane, and you don't tell me that you don't know that flying is not really good for the environment, but still people come here by plane. So we shouldn't do that. If we can't do it, then how can we expect other people to do it? And also, we should stop doing all this research on single interventions. We know what to do. We've seen all these reports, and we should really try to think about how can we actually get there. And one of these things is what I really liked about my talk about the Dare to Share. I think, like, how can we combine all the knowledge that we have and give it to people like Bruce Lee, who's making all these beautiful SimCity models of obesity, and instead of asking, are these models correct, or is system science, does it show the correct model, we should really try to share our data and try to make the models correct, instead of keep focusing on these small interventions. So that's really, my points, what I think we should do, and we should really engage the citizens and call for action and do it now. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to talk, and I'm either talking to the advanced elite or the worried well. I'm not sure who hangs around this late after. I'm thinking back over the week we've had, and I want to thank the conference for hosting this event and having us here. I'm thinking back to that very first session of Professor Sir Andy Haynes, and he made a really beautiful erudite presentation about, first of all, what we know about climate change, about the changes we've seen over time, about the future we can expect to see, about the expected rising temperatures, the expected rising sea levels, the degradation of our forests, the degradation of our soils, the likely deaths from flooding and disease. It was a brilliant talk. And at the end of that talk, I had two of my researchers sitting next to me, and I said, well, what do you think? You know, we came this week, we thought we'd see a couple of RCTs, a few p-values, and our starting point is the world as we know it is about to end, and we're going to burn to death. And my researcher said, yeah, well, I think we're fully in trouble, they said. And I've tidied the language up a little bit, but I want to make the point that when we talk about climate change, we're always talking about crisis. And that's legitimate to get the action that we need, but I think we need to start to shift our focus. And this is one of the challenges I think a research society like this needs to begin to pick up, and that is not what, but how. We know a lot about the what, and those who are going to disagree about the what are not going to change their minds no matter what we do. I think the shift we need to make is towards the how. I'm going to talk in some detail about the Lancet Commission on Obesity, and I was a member of that along with Wilma and several others. And I just want to make a point that in talking about that, I'm really representing more than 40 experts from 20 countries around the world. And I think that's an important point to make, because it drew people together from climate change, from sociology, from epidemiology, from big business, from the World Trade Organization, and all over. And the point being that this isn't a single field's problem to solve. This can't be solved by one researcher working in one silo on one part of the problem. And I want to put that a little bit of a different way. So these Lancet Commissions are big pieces of work. There are a lot of meetings where there's a lot of butting of heads and contestation of ideas. And one of the initial starting points was really the socio-ecological model. And everybody here knows the socio-ecological model. Individual in the middle, surrounded by a family, surrounded by organisations, surrounded by society, surrounded by policies, and so on and so on. And the starting point was to say that model is failing us. And in fact, our starting point from here on in, if we're going to take obesity seriously for a start, is to begin with the natural system at the centre of our model. If it's not good for the natural system, it's not good for anything else. And out from there, we think about social determinants of macro systems, governance, and so on, and environments, mesosystems and microsystems. And the point being that without the natural system, human health and well-being, ecological health and well-being, economic prosperity and social equity aren't possible. And those chickens are only just coming home to roost, but it's been coming at us for a long time. Of course, this model doesn't challenge too many of us, and in fact, when we did this work, we do a lot of work with Maori and First Nations people and Indigenous people in Australia, and they look at this and say, this is how we've been looking at things for the last 100,000 years. What's the big deal? We don't understand. And nature is at the centre of each of those societies, and we've just missed that point for far too long. So the first challenge I would make is to say natural system needs to be at the centre of our logic model for anything that we do. The second point to make is that malnutrition in all its forms and climate change represents a global syndemic, and these are changes happening hand in hand and feeding each other over time. And so you can see when you start to think of this logic model from the point of view of a global syndemic, these three things, obesity, undernutrition and climate change, have evolved together and have the same underlying drivers, notably overconsumption, use of natural resources above and beyond sustainability, and so on and so on. And if we start thinking about this as a global syndemic, that is a very, very challenging way to think about something if you're trained to think about a single behaviour and a single exposure and a single p-value, which is exactly where I've been for a long, long time. But if we are going to think about this with natural systems at the centre of everything we do, we have to think about the interconnectedness of all the things we were talking about. So I want to come back a step to not what, but how. And Wilma mentioned doing a huge amount of work on existing reports, and I just want to show you a few of those. Here are 66 reports at the UN level on physical activity, nutrition or climate change between 2007 and 2017, and they contain more than 250 recommendations, 36 of which explicitly mention nutrition. And some of the fantastic work Wilma did is ask, well, if all we did was enact those policies, what would happen? And there's a lot here, and I don't expect you to see too much of it, but the point is just enacting these policies like strengthening integration of nutrition within national policies actually has effects on both mitigating climate change and adaptation to climate change. And there's a whole raft of these that at some levels go towards some level of mitigation and some level of adaptation to climate change and to malnutrition in all its forms. Not what, but how. And if we think about these three outcomes, if we think about a global syndemic, then there are triple duty actions. That is, actions that can hit all three of those outcomes that we fear at the same time. For example, and this will come up again and again and again, but reducing red meat consumption doesn't just do something for obesity, but it does. It does something for healthier diets, for cancer and obesity prevention. It also has positive effects on undernutrition, making more land for efficient, sustainable agriculture. And it does something for climate change, as we know, lower GHG emissions from agriculture, triple duty actions. And yet, most times you've heard somebody talk about one of these potential changes, it's on the basis of one particular target outcome. In fact, there are triple duty actions. To give a second example, sustainable dietary guidelines promoting food and beverages for health and sustainability have effects across all three. More healthy, less unhealthy food choices promoted. Easy, simple, there's been 150 presentations on it this week. Same with undernutrition, but also decreasing demand for unsustainable food choices. I'm a cynic when I'm told the answer is a policy change, because I work with governments, and I'm an Australian, as you can probably hear, but as most of us know, there's government turmoil all around the world. I think in the last 2 years, Australia is up to Prime Minister number 10, and so maybe that's not the level of leadership that's necessary. So where does the leadership come from? Where does the pressure come from to create change? Not what, but how. And here's just one example. Just several weeks ago, children walked out of school around the world to protest that nothing was being done about climate change. And this occurred in more than 2,300 cities across 128 countries, involving 1.4 million children who walked out to say, enough is enough, we need you to act. My work is in communities, empowering them to find solutions to child health, and the communities that do the best are the ones that get angry. And they say, and you see over and over again, enough is enough, it's time for us to act. Not what, but how. How are we going to make this change? I exclude someone on the right there who thinks that getting out of maths was the reason to do this, but I think most of the kids here were genuine. So what does this mean for directions in research? Not what, but how. How do we put the tools in the hands of people to understand this complexity, to find the places where intervention is possible, to work in a collective, collaborative manner and make significant, serious change? And I want to point to just one example of that, which is a project several of us in the room are working on called Co-Create. The objective being to give adolescents a voice to work with policymakers to shift the way that we think about food and food environments to improve the health of adolescents. Classic quote from one of the participants in this study, not about us, without us. Don't do this to us, do it with us, and this co-creation is critical. What about for all actors? Well, just thinking in global syndemic terms, just understanding common causes and looking for common solutions is a pretty good start. Wilma challenged you to ask how you got here. I would ask the same challenge, but I'd ask this question too. If you think this is a serious problem, and you must, or you wouldn't have hung around for this, then is this part of your thinking when you design studies, when you interact with colleagues, when you think about the way that your work is headed in the future? And do you do this work together? And I'm as guilty as anyone else of being an awfully competitive, horrible academic when I have to be. But I've also built software that I give away for less than cost price to allow communities to find ways to work together to understand possible solutions. I understand the pessimism, and I share it, and I'm as frightened as anybody else for my kids and what might happen for their kids. I think we need to empower the generations that are coming next to drive this change. And we know Trump's a problem, but equally we've just seen elections in the EU where climate change was a significant factor in the result. And I believe it was Joe Biden is just committed to making the US carbon neutral by 2050 if elected. So I think the wheel is turning. I think the challenge for this room is just what is our role in making that happen? Not what, but how. And if not you, then who? Thank you.
Well, thank you, all three. I don't know if I sensed a lot of disagreement between you, but there clearly is a theme here now. Not what, but how. So what is the research agenda that we are going to put together? And but before that question, do any of you want to comment on each other's?
You thought it was fab?
Yes, yeah. What I was going to say. Yeah, no, I thought it was really excellent how the three presentations fitted together and how we I mean, it might be a little bit boring for the audience that we all agree, but it clearly shows that we know what, and now we need to move on to how. And yeah, I really like it how we challenge you guys, and we really like to hear from you guys what you think, and whether you agree with this, or whether you still feel a bit uncomfortable about these positions that we just taken. So I'd just be interested to hear what the audience thinks.
I'd just re-emphasise, in getting ready to do this, we were talking and saying, hang on, we're agreeing about this, hang on. And the tension for me, I do a lot of childhood obesity research, and a lot of just getting so frustrated with the antipathy of communities. And the question is, how do we get movement? We know what has to happen. How do we get movement? And the role of a room like this, this is as highly educated as it gets on the planet, as privileged as it gets on the planet. What's our role? Our role has to be to use that intellect to create the how. It just has to be.
I just have a question for the last presentation, because in Norway, the last weeks we have had other people being arguing for against street stalls in Norway, and it's a huge campaign, and they started a party, and in the second largest city, it says that it's 20% say that they will vote for that party. So how the children and adolescents getting together, it's very nice, but there's also other people. So how do we get all the people going the same direction, because there are other people going other directions?
Well, do you want to?
Very quickly. So one of the things is a collective agenda. So when we map systems, it's okay that people see different cause and effect, and see places where, look, I work over here, you work over there, there's things we disagree on. But where we agree, that's where you get leverage. And the global syndemic, there's 3 massive fields of activity that don't really work together yet. So you imagine the sugar argument comes from health, but if that was backed up by the ecologists and backed up by nutritionists and so on, that's a very different argument.
So if we agree on what, then the question is really how. And please do line up behind the microphones if you want to join the discussion. So looking at what we do from the health perspective, we really use your own health as a main motivating factor for changing behavior. But if you look at the environmental movement, it might be more the common good, the globe, the planet. It isn't just yourself. And that seems to be a really strong motivating factor among young people these days. You mentioned the school strikes. Greta Thunberg has become such an important model for so many young people. And what can we learn, or how can we tie that into our agenda, I think would be an interesting question to hear your voice on. But now I see we have a number of people here, so please, go ahead.
Thanks for your remarks. Great panel. So how do I do the calculus about conferences? So in November, I'm going to be part of a virtual conference, and I'm going to record a video of myself and send it, post it, and people can, tweet me questions and stuff. But I know that that's not going to be nearly as good as ISBNPA here. And of course, I flew here, and I'm going to fly to Omaha. We'll see whether I get to fly to Auckland. So talk about that calculus to make our decisions about how to, be productive scientists and enjoy the pleasure of community and collaboration that often can only arise in person.
Thank you. Can we take a couple of more comments and then, please?
I have 2 short questions. First of all, I think that there is some sort of an oversimplification when there is this synergy between a healthy planet and a healthy individual nutrition going on, and then basically facts are bended just around, just like as it suits basically the corresponding research agenda. So for example, if you looked at what is called such a fast food meal, then works from Nicole Darman and so on, they have shown that basically if you are healthy diets, including lots of vegetables, needing a lot of water, irrigation, and energy and being not energy dense, need a higher amount of, or associated with a higher amount of greenhouse gas emissions as compared to fast food meat from McDonald's, right? So this is one thing. The other thing, when we are starting to remove meat as one of the heavily contributing food the cause of a major part of the greenhouse emissions, then we are also deleting highly bioavailable iron. But still then the problem of iron deficiency associated anemia, which is still prevalent in many countries, starts to be basically challenged. Likewise, the same situation with calcium, which is also one of the top critical nutrients, right? How do you want to include these contradictions in your solutions? That's my first point. My second point, just very briefly, I talked to my dad this morning, what are you doing there? And basically, he's an engineer, not interested in environmental issues and so on. And I talked to him yesterday in the evening over a beer. And today and this morning, he came to me and he said, oh, look, I've found a solution. You give every citizen basically a certain amount of carbon dioxide at birth, and he will be allowed to use this up. And after reaching a certain limit, he will have just a basic amount of carbon dioxide spendings allowed, which are necessary for survival. But for example, he wouldn't be allowed to fly or something like that. So I know this is some sort of an utopic, socialistic approach, but nevertheless, I would like to hear your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll take a third comment too, and then we'll have response from the panel.
Hi, my name is Annette Alberg, and I come from Vallejo, California, which is a working class city near San Francisco. And one thing that I think is part of the how is to join with other large areas of concern of things that need to be remedied, like social justice and equity, and start to bring together those discussions and together those populations so that there's an idea that the community that is looking at science and an interest in the global environment also is working with and caring about and committed to social justice, and to start putting that into the model, that the ideas of discrimination, or what we call in the US the school to prison pipeline that is involving so many of our citizens. And the other how issue that I wanted to mention as scientists is maybe looking at ways to work together with communities to change situations, including them in science. Like many people here use the community-based participatory research, which Barbara Israel and other people who have championed that with social justice and with health and social equity say that CBPR is the operationalization of health and social equity. So I think that's a how that we can do our business differently with different partners and give up some of the control.
Thank you. Important questions. Steve, do you want to start?
They're great questions, thank you. On the oversimplification and is it really about meat and what about the unintended consequences, a lot of the work that we're doing is using what is known as systems approaches, and I urge caution in what that is, because it means a lot of people to a lot of things to a lot of different people. We in particular use an approach called system dynamics, and that was born out of MIT in particular in Boston, and started with trying to understand climate change as one of its major points of departure. But one of the critical questions you ask when you start to take that approach are, what are the ranges of relationships of cause and effect that we're interested in a particular system? How do they interact with each other? How do we track them over time? And what are the unintended consequences that we didn't see or didn't expect because we hadn't understood the system fully in the first place? And it's a fundamental turning on its head of this idea of we identify a single individual behaviour, work on that in individuals and randomise out context. It's completely the opposite. It's, all right, what are the contextual things here? How are they interacting with what we're trying to do? What's happening as a result that we didn't expect, and what do we do about it? So from my point of view, I think this shift that I've seen this week to systems language, and indeed Bruce Lee, is one of the world leaders in this stuff, is a real positive. It may not be a challenge, but if I was at ISBNPA 5 years ago, and I think it would have been a major challenge to the society to say, you've got to think beyond the individual, and you've got to think about it beyond single relations of cause and effect. In terms of the climate calculus, I did have a moment when I was sitting in the first plenary thinking, gosh, I've got to do something on climate change on Friday. And I've flown here from Australia, and that's 34 hours of flying. And I looked into it, and I discovered we automatically do a carbon offset as a part of our flight booking. Now, that's not everything, but that's a policy position that immediately does something about that. And just briefly on the participatory research, I fundamentally 100% agree. And the work that we're doing is to try and make systems thinking a participatory process, so to allow communities in to identifying complex solutions and finding them for themselves. And to be honest, when we work with communities, I don't know the answer. Those communities know them a long way before we do. So that would be my comments.
Just a few additional comments to that. I thought that the second gentleman almost answered his own question about whether we should, fly here, and whether that's still better than video conferencing in, and then saying maybe we all need individual caps on CO2 emissions, basically the same that we already have for some industries, saying they have a maximum amount of greenhouse gases that they can have. And really, what I'd like you to challenge to think about is that flying is heavily subsidized at the moment. And would you still have come here by plane all the way if it was 5, 10, 20 times as expensive? Or would you then have thought, well, maybe I could use my financial resources, the university money, it's public money, lots of us are publicly funded. Would we still use that to fly all the way over here? Or would I then have made a different choice? So it's kind of these ways of the costs that we see, and this is for food, it's the same. It's not the real price that we are paying, and we're paying it now for the future generations. But if we are incorporating that kind of costs, then probably a lot of us would have made a different decision. And that's the reality. I mean, we have finite resources. They aren't infinite. We can't just pretend that isn't the case. So I think that's really important to think about. And also the remark about meat, I wasn't part of the Lancet Eat Commission, and I'm not sure if there's someone here that is at the moment, but I think they have been really careful about the calculations for meat and in different regions in the world, and also really try as good as we can, because as Barry Popkin just said, we have really bad models for knowing all the emissions for specific foods. But really they have been considerate about that, and we do eat way too much meat. So it's not about eating no meat at all, and we all have to eat plants, but it has to be a lot less from what we are consuming now, and that's the message. It's not no meat at all, and it is different in different regions of the world, but it definitely, for us in the Western world, it is clear that it has to shift to plant-based diets. So that's
I may just add a thing to the last question about meat, and I think one really big issue is that we are approaching 10 billion people, and we have one globe to produce all that food, and we are not able to produce only a certain amount of meat, I think, in the future. But I agree to Wilma, but it's also a good question, because I don't think that we really know, but we have to calculate this.
So we've had our dietary guidelines for a long time, and if you look at my country, in Norway, we see that maybe 30% of the population are meeting the dietary guidelines. So we really are a far way from achieving the goals that we have set. So now we have this challenge with also addressing sustainability, but could that be seen then as a positive thing in terms of moving the agenda, in terms of healthy eating and active transportation further, that it is a different way of motivating people?
the work we do is to start with an individual outcome, childhood obesity prevalence, say, and we talk about how it's behaved over time, and then we ask a group of community leaders, well, what's led to this change? What else has changed that we've seen happen here? What's changing as a result? And we build systems maps of that discussion with quite a bit of system dynamics thinking going into it. What strikes me, and it comes to the comment that was made before, is every time we look at one of those maps, the individual is not represented. They become collective representations of cause and effect very quickly. And the second thing that stands out to me is that you get to social determinants very quickly. And so in the communities I work with in Western Victoria, in New Zealand, in Canada, and in other places, very quickly weather patterns become a serious issue. Severe weather is a serious issue. When we're talking about the health of our kids with communities, they get it. When we compare what these communities say to the foresight model, and we say, how does this compare to an expert view of 2007? The communities get all of the variables that the foresight model did, plus environmental variables like change in climate, like harsh weather, like inability to go outside and play, and on and on and on. I personally think we're dragging behind, and we have to move quicker. And it's giving the tools, but it's also being able to collect the information to tell the story.
We have another comment. Kim, please.
Yeah, hi, Kim Gans from the University of Connecticut. So one of the things I was thinking about when we were talking about, what we could do as a conference, I was thinking about maybe changing our policies regarding catering in terms of the types of foods that are served. We always have healthy food at these conferences, which is great, but maybe we could think about, having some catering policies around maybe less red meat, not that there's a lot, but maybe having none, and also around waste. I'm not sure, you want to make sure there's enough food for all the people at the conference, but maybe there's a way that we can work with the venue or the food service to think about, how do we handle the waste that's happening at the conference. We have a lot of food service, a lot of breaks and a lot of meals, and maybe we can think about that more as a society and think about maybe some policies around that we could adopt ourselves.
Yeah, thank you. It is really interesting how it is both bringing up how this challenges us as a society and also as individual researchers and our research agenda in addition to our personal private behavior. Please, May.
Yeah, I want to thank Kim for this introduction, because Erica and I already discussed that for Auckland we will definitely work on sustainable diets, and if I choose it, then it will be completely plant-based, but we already decided that the default will be plant-based. So instead of marking that you want a vegetarian or vegan diet, you have to mark if you insist on meat, or maybe we could even omit meat at all.
Great, thank you.
And I would strongly encourage that in the communities we've worked in where they've made active decisions to change food procurement. So local government will say, if your food isn't completely green, we will no longer use that particular provider. It shifts the economy and it shifts the businesses in that community to provide green food, because they know they won't be competitive without it. I can't imagine what the food budget is here, but if you're saying to caterers in Auckland, if you can meet these conditions, you've got the contract. That's a very powerful thing to be able to do.
Thanks. You know what? Our 1 hour is already up. I'm going to let each of the panel participants have a final comment, and then I think we're coming close to a closure. Elling?
Okay, thank you, Knut-Inge. I think my final comment will be, again, to my speech, that diet is also really important for sustainable physical activity, and to kind of state the impact again, that's the importance of diet, and especially reducing meat consumption, and also the issue of waste that was taken up here.
I'd really like to thank ISBNPA and thank everyone who's here to listen to our panel, and it's such an encouragement to hear your comments. I think as a panel we weren't sure how people would react to the things that we say, but it's so good to know that there's this support in the society, and that most of us here feel that we need to move. So that's a great start. So thank you very much for that.
And I'd echo the thanks and just reiterate how far I think ISBNPA's moved. You know, I started coming here maybe more than 10 years ago, and the conversation about systems and environment was absent then. I think that's fair to say. And I don't see myself an expert in systems at all. I think our role has become to give our citizens the best science to help them find the right solutions for their problems. And I think we have to rethink our role in that direction.
Thank you, all of you. I just want to echo the comments from you all, and also say that I just heard that our incoming president just promised that ISBNPA will be the #1 model society for how to run these type of meetings in a sustainable manner. And I think it is also important that this topic will be on the agenda, so that we also in that way could help shape the research agenda of the members of the society. So with that, I also want to thank all of you for staying on and joining in this discussion, and in particular, thanking the panel members. So thank you all.